I'd like to begin with addressing this strategic challenges component a little bit, because when talking to many Western policymakers and experts, I'm struck how many of them still perceive Putin's war against Ukraine as just something bilateral that happens between Putin and Ukraine. It is not. And I think this is something which is underappreciated by the Western public in general. For instance, there's been an election campaign in Slovakia in the past few months, and I came there and talked to people who were participating in that, and I said to many of them, do you remember that 2 years ago, before invading Ukraine, Russia actually put forward a public set of what they call security guarantees, when one of the key demands was that all new NATO member states that have joined since 1997 actually cancel all troop and weapons deployments to the configuration that existed beforehand, before 1997. Means that, and it was exactly the same language that they used to justify Putin's aggression against Ukraine, meaning that Moscow currently does not consider all new NATO member states as fully sovereign. They believe that they can actually dictate what kind of defense and security policy these countries are about to choose, and this, as we know from the example of aggression against Ukraine, this is just a first step, a pretext for something bigger. Meaning that if the question is, if Russia somehow succeeds or considers its war against Ukraine successful, will it go further? From the declaration about security guarantees released 2 years ago, I think the clear answer is yes. Which means that when we discuss what is currently going on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, it's just not enough to have this narrow focus. We need to look further. We need to also follow some major efforts of Moscow, like look how much money they are investing right now to support anti-European, anti-Western parties in Moldova. Here's another example, and they have been openly mulling, very publicly, Russian government officials and pro-government experts, state propaganda, they have been openly mulling that that's probably the next target. The Baltic states, northern Kazakhstan, whatever. So I think it is important to understand that we have a strategic threat here coming not only from Putin's Russia, but in a broader sense, from a wide range of autocratic regimes who have major difficulties at home. Autocratic regimes cannot generate a successful future vision development model as an alternative to the Western way of life. Their own populations are deeply unhappy with what is going on. We can talk about it further, but I know how this happens in Russia, but you could have seen this in Iran and other places. So expansion is the only natural way for them to compensate for all the domestic failures, which means that if we look at China's economic slowdown at the moment, that, bearing in mind my Russian experience, looks kind of threatening to me. Because China's economic downturn is systemic, there's no easy way out of that. They have to find a model to go further economically. How does Xi Jinping compensate for all these economic difficulties? Little victorious war, as usual. So I think that kind of elevates that threat. And another important issue is that all these autocratic regimes, they cooperate. They help each other in all these different ventures that they are into. Iranians and North Koreans are supplying weapons to Russia. Chinese not yet, but it's providing a significant economic assistance. And Gaza militants in Hamas, if they were not backed by Iran, I think there would have been a great certainty that their assertiveness would be significantly lower than we have seen recently. So here are some strategic threats. It should not be narrowed down to whatever issues there are between Russia and Ukraine. We should see it as a development of some global challenges to international rule-based order, which was also mentioned by colleagues. And it is important to look at whatever happens through that light, in exactly that kind of paradigm, in which case all that the colleagues have been talking about during this previous session becomes very relevant about strengthening defenses against these strategic challenges. The other thing which strikes me, and I think here is where Putin sees his lifeline, is a great degree of Western impatience. Oh, Ukrainian counteroffensive has been going on for 5 months and they still haven't achieved a breakthrough, which means it was all in vain. 5 months. I mean, Russia and Russian military, Russian economy, it has a lot of problems, but it still has a lot of strengths. 5 months in this regard, it's nothing. It's a beast, big beast to strangle, right? So patience is needed. I personally can tell you that our analysis shows that there is still significant potential for a Ukrainian breakthrough on a battlefield in the months to come. Because first, the manpower potential of the Russian military is getting significantly worn out. If you really look at whatever information comes there from the battlefield, troops are exhausted. There is zero rotation. Most potent and capable and combat-ready troops have been decimated. You really have a much more secondary-class personnel fighting out there. So a little more patience and results can be achieved. With whatever skills Russians have developed during nearly 2 years of the war, yes, they do the heavy mining and fortifications. Yes, they use radio-electronic defense and air defenses pretty successfully. Yes, they have the air superiority, but troops on the ground, that's the weak part. So we have to exercise some patience here. Economy, another major issue. For those of you who are interested, I've just published an update at the Globsec website about the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Many people judge that in a primitive black and white sense. If the Russian economy still hasn't collapsed, it means that sanctions are not effective. It hasn't collapsed, but sanctions are having the profound effect, which is deepening over time. I just listened to the chairman of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, who's been speaking in the State Duma, Russia's federal parliament, a few days ago. She says, we need a prolonged, lengthy period of extremely tight monetary policy to maintain control over inflation. Inflation is caused by ruble depreciation, which is caused by sanctions, because Russia cannot and will not be able to produce anything. It has to import from China, Turkey, and elsewhere. Sanctions have deprived Russia's ability to launch a major import substitution. They need international cooperation for that. They need component parts, technologies. Import substitution not working. Russia imports a lot. That puts pressure on the ruble. Ruble puts pressure on the inflation. Inflation causes extreme rate hikes, 15%. That's growth prohibitive. So sanctions do work, and I will not go into too much detail, but patience. Again, we're coming to the issue of, when we talk about strategic challenges, we need strategic patience. Russia is a big player. It still has a lot of resources, and Putin still has a lot of determination. Just look at his recently approved 3-year federal budget, which is not only envisaging significant increase of military spending for next year, but 2- or 3-fold increase of military spending for 3 years ahead, as compared to the level of 2021. That means it also comes at a huge price for the Russian economy, because it will be paid with significant increase of taxation, which will be another growth killer in pair with the central bank rate hikes. But Putin is determined, and he considers this as a long-term, lengthy fight. He is prepared. He is prepared to be patient. So if the democratic world does not want to lose this fight against Putin, who wants to redraw the international order, no less. It's not about Ukraine, it's about international order. then we need patience, and we need to understand also the weak sides, because there are plenty. The army is getting worn out by the day, the economic resources are getting worn out, sanctions are working, but he still has a lot of capability, which means it takes time. I think the biggest security challenge, I was listening to colleagues, and I tend to agree with all that's been said about European defense capabilities, but I think the biggest issue is not the hard power. The biggest issue is understanding that we are in a protracted standoff with major global autocracies for redrawing the global order. That means if policymakers, if the societies don't have patience to fight for this order, to participate in a lengthy, protracted fight, then Putin wins. We should not afford it. That means patience is the key strategic resource that we should be counting upon. Thank you.
Mr. Milov, for
Unity. Unity does miracles, because Putin did not expect that the West would provide such a significant military aid to Ukraine. He thought that Europe is going to freeze in the winter without Russian gas. This is actually why he invaded. He underestimated the Western unity, European unity, so keep it.
Thank you. Also a very clear statement. Sven Biskop.
Maybe, and then to bring a bit debate into the panel, to read the world correctly. And I slightly disagree with the analysis of how the authoritarian regimes work together. Of course, to some extent they don't, but not fully. I think what we rather see is that each of these authoritarian regimes pursue the national interest. And for example, you see very clearly that China will not allow Russia to push it in a direction that it doesn't want to go, and that it carefully calibrates how far it goes, supporting Russia so that it doesn't lose it as a partner to counterbalance the US, but not to such an extent that it has to break with us. So I think the dynamics of world politics is not sort of Democrats versus autocrats. I think it's states pursuing their interest. And yeah, some of the autocrats, actually, we need them. Many of the autocrats are neutral on the specific issue of the Russian-Ukrainian war, and we should be careful not to push them into that camp. So this calls for us for a more nuanced diplomacy. It also means that we have to push aside a bit this rhetoric that we always have of democracy versus autocracy, or abandon, I think, the unrealistic idea that the point of our foreign policy is to democratize the world. I would say the point of our foreign policy is to preserve our democracy.
A very interesting debate about democracies versus autocracies. Definitely, you should not take my remarks as a need to launch a crusade against autocratic regimes. No. Yes, there is limited convergence between them, and the free world needs to exploit that. And that's a there are cracks in this unity, which is very important. But 20 years ago, I also attended a lot of these debates, and largely it was believed that Russia and China, with all this integration into globalization, benefiting economically, they will be just a bigger version of United Arab Emirates. Here we are now, 20 years down the road. I personally do not really think that there is a prevailing certainty that China would attack Taiwan. Moreover, after Putin's failures in Ukraine, they would probably think twice, thrice, 10 times before doing that. However, I remember what people said 20 years ago, all these papers wrote by think tanks in Washington, that next step, China becomes democracy. Right? Seriously, you can download, all this exists, the papers never burned, right? So and here we are now, not only discussing the very possibility of China attacking Taiwan, but with a very specific need to spend a lot of money, very practical, pragmatic money to defend Taiwan, just in case. Whether China will attack or not, we don't know, but the threat is far more real now than it was 20 years ago. So we should see a pattern here, and I can tell you two things. As a guy who lived under autocracy more than half of my life, in Soviet Union and later under Putin. First, consolidation of power removes barriers. When you are constrained by public opinion and all of that sorts, you will think twice. If you don't have constraints, why not? Let's attack somebody. The second thing, again, there's a fundamental problem. We see a pattern here. Autocracies cannot deliver good well-being. the situation deteriorates. How do you compensate for that? Small victorious war. This is perpetual, which is why we should definitely no crusades. We should exploit the differences. We should also offer some incentives for autocracies who behave and obey international rule-based order true. But we should see a pattern here if we're talking about strategic challenges.